How many were registered?
Good afternoon, everyone. Are we there live, Brittany?
Yep, looks like we are. Should be good to go.
Great. I'll turn it over to you, Brittany.
Okay, sounds good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our last town hall on the retirement plans review. We have quite a bit of information to get through today, so I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation. But as you think of them, please feel free to put them in either the chat or the Q&A, and we will address those at the end of the presentation or as they come up via text. This session is also being recorded, so we can post it to the website for those who are unable to attend. So just a heads up on that. And otherwise, I think we're ready to begin. I will turn it over to Robin Fergus, the VP for Human Resources.
Thank you, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a robust presentation to share today. As you know, the topic is retirement plan review. Myself and my colleague, Joseph DeVerde, who is an associate professor in our chemistry department, and also has served as the committee chair for this project, will be presenting today, as well as our colleague from Innovest Solutions, Troy Jensen, is here to share his expertise and the role Innovest played on the project. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We're very excited to hear from you today, and we'll go ahead and get started. So a little history. So the team has been working on this project for the last 2 years during the COVID pandemic. And we are taking the opportunity this fall to socialize the work of the committee and to share ideas and answer questions and take your input before we move our recommendations forward to our Board of Governors later this year. So we'd like to just do a little brief history of the plan and how we've arrived at the point we are today. Many of you will remember that the defined contribution plan was created back in the early 90s, and this was a plan that was introduced due to changes in the retirement landscape at the time. We had previously had para for all employees, and some legislative changes allowed us to introduce the defined contribution plan, which reflected the design at the time. We had a fewer number of fund choices than we do today. The funds have actually grown exponentially. We have well over 300 choices in the DCP and just as many, if not more, in our 457 voluntary plans. And we're watching today's environment, and the landscape is continuing to change. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But it was time. We do regular reviews of our programs and our offerings. However, this was the most in-depth and comprehensive review that has taken place since the inception of the plans. And I want to thank our partners at Innovest, as well as our devoted committee who have spent hours toiling away, learning about best practices in this landscape and are helping us guide university decisions about how we move forward. We want to make sure our goal for all is to ensure that the plan is preparing all of us, the plan participants, which are our employee group, as well as retirees, and those of us who may have left the institution as well, who still have funds in the plans, have the best approach, and they're most prepared for when their time to retire comes along. So that was at the forefront of the mind of this committee as we were looking at all of the services provided in our current landscape. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we began this work at the height of the pandemic back in the spring of 2020. And the focus has really been on the DCP plan and our 403 voluntary plan, as well as our student employee retirement program, which is abbreviated as SERP. This did not include any review of para or any of the para supplementary plans. Those are not under our purview. They reside at para at the state level, and we only focused on the ones that are under the purview of the Colorado State University. The committee worked, as I mentioned, with Innovest Solutions to guide us throughout the project. And we had a robust committee with representatives from our University Benefits Committee, the APC, the Administrative Professional Council, as well as the Faculty Council, and membership from our Financial Services Unit on campus that made up the committee. And Joseph will share a little bit more about that committee later. We also were informed by the work of a survey that we sent out in the fall of 2020 to our workforce as well as retirees. And we also solicited input and answered questions about the scope of the project through multiple webinars during the pandemic. And Innovest helped us prepare a request for qualification that was governed by our procurement rules and sent out to our current vendors, as well as any other interested in financial institution that wanted to learn more about the review being conducted at CSU. So we solicited input and built that RFQ with the guidance of the committee and Innovest. And then, of course, Innovest provided us in-depth education and acted as a resource throughout the project and continues to do so. As I mentioned, we are at a stage right now where we are getting ready to share those recommendations with our Board of Governors. Next slide. And that review is governed still by our procurement process. So we have some strict rules in place where we have to maintain the confidentiality of the procurement practices to ensure we can leverage the best outcome for the university. So today we're here to make sure that you all have an opportunity to hear more about the process that led up to this point in time. And we anticipate we'll be coming back out with a communication strategy once the Board of Governors renders a final decision on the vendor or vendors that are selected ultimately following the recommendation from the committee and human resources. We must send this under the master plan document for the defined contribution plan. Requires us to have the Board of Governors weigh in on the approval of a record keeper environment. And Joseph will share more about a record keeper. It's essentially a term that is used for the vendors that I've been referencing. And once we have that final decision, as I said, we will have a robust roadshow communication plan to ensure that all plan participants are aware of the changes and have an understanding of their rights and decisions under that process. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Troy to share a little bit more about Innovest and their role on the project.
Yeah, thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, everybody. I can't echo enough the work of the committee is something that we were impressed with, and I think stretched longer than anybody expected, and a lot of diligent effort to comprehensively look at all of this. I'll give you a little bit about what Innovest's role in the process was. That term consultant has good, bad, and otherwise connotations at times, but really we are an independent consultant. We don't have any product to sell other than our expertise. That's our role, is to help guide the committee, help guide the university in analyzing what makes sense for you, what's the best interest of retirement plan savers. We're located in Denver here, operate throughout I think 38 states at this point, but mainly in the Mountain West here. Our approach has been to be really a fiduciary and an advocate for participants, and to help plan sponsors and fiduciaries in that role to execute that appropriately. My grandmother, one of my, sort of namesake, sort of established my personality, really is the way to put it. She was a college professor of literature, writing, and poetry. I point out our tagline there, making retirement work. That's one of those things that, as we put that in place with that, you can actually read that two ways. That retirement that works for you is what we intended, but we don't want to make retirement work. We don't want to make an effort to make retirement happen. But ultimately, that's our goal, is to really put the interest of you as savers in the retirement plan and in retirement as the primary focus. So what does that mean? Go on to the next slide, and I'll give you a quick overview of what that fiduciary responsibility entails. It's not just a practice, a committee. It really is a personal responsibility to look out for the best interest of those whose assets you oversee. So we highlight that in the 4 bullet points in the middle. The duty of loyalty is maybe the most important. We put it at the top for a reason. When you're fiduciary in this context for the CSU retirement plans, you don't owe your decisions to the university. You owe them to the individuals who are saving in the university plans. It's an important distinction. And I think it's that loyalty to the best interest of participants that really put the context around how we structured this search, how the analysis of the retirement plans. That then becomes a duty of prudence, and that the decision-making that we go about in approaching that needs to be done as a prudent expert would, familiar with all the facts and circumstances, understanding the context, the best practices in the industry, the way that things should be done appropriately is that duty of prudence. Beyond that, investment side, we want to diversify, make sure that we have different types of investment choices with different risk and reward characteristics. And then following plan documents, regulatory requirements. You see that ERISA mentioned at the top, that's an Employee Retirement Income Securities Act. It doesn't govern public plans like this one directly, but it does define a lot of the language that's then echoed in the Uniform Prudent Investors Act. So the Colorado state by state type language parallels what's in ERISA. So that prudence and loyalty piece really defines how we go about it. It's the scaffolding or the structure around it. And we get to the work of the committee. As we go to the next page and talk about what that means, Robin mentioned this request for qualifications. It sounds maybe almost simple in that sense of we're just asking for, are you qualified to do this? But that's the most critical component when we're looking for a vendor to provide these services. We can choose the investments. We want to, kind of decouple that from the provider's approach. And that's the focus of a retirement plan, is having an investment vehicle, but delivering those services, operating the trades, the contributions, the withdrawals, the pieces that really interact with you as employees or former employees is significant. And we want to make sure that that's appropriate and then priced right. So we think about participant fees, the background of the staff, the quality across the board. Data security has become a key component. We know that the information surrounding your assets is almost as valuable as the assets themselves these days, because that's a target as well. And then we want stability. And so we focused on really providers that were out there that are up to the task, and make sure that they have that qualified status to be able to handle plans the size and the complexity of what we have for the CSU structure. We go to the next page and think about how we went about understanding more. We did, again, as Robin mentioned, survey, and those of you that responded, we greatly appreciate that. That helps color in some of the perspectives and attitudes and understanding of the plans, and steers us a little bit as to how we can best serve what the survey identified. So we found, and this is not atypical from a lot of retirement plan participants in various employers, but the desire for more communication regarding plans is a significant one. Communication is probably always a good thing, but certainly when it comes to your assets. We want more individual assistance in navigating the investment options. We want fully understanding of the retirement plan options themselves. And I think that complexity of having different choices and overlap and pieces that can be confusing at times is something part of the focus that took on as we analyze things. Lower cost. So the lower cost is a key component. It's not the end all. We're not looking for the low bid, so to speak, the bottom line, can you do it for this amount of fee? We want to make sure that we have valuable services for the cost being paid, and that those services match the cost being paid. We don't want to overpay, and we don't want underperforming services if we're paying the right amount. And then lastly, the quality of investment options over quantity. This is significant, I think, in understanding when we have what was mentioned earlier, 300 plus different investment choices, many that do the same thing but at a different price. So there's essentially the same investment offering, but a higher expense ratio. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So we want to make sure that the quality and the performance of the investments stacks up over offering a multitude of choices. So beyond that, the higher education retirement plan environment is a little bit different than what we see across, say, corporate plans or even government plans generally. Public service in that realm is a specialty of Innovest, something that we focus on pretty significantly across Colorado. And it's unique. There's some complex plan administration. And when you talk about multiple vendors, this is a hallmark of what has been the structure for a long time. It's not necessarily the best, though. It tends to become who brings the best bagels and meets with you on a regular basis, not necessarily the best investment choice. So I want to make sure that we have both, that there's a good relational piece, and then a good investment structure and delivery of services that surrounds that relationship and not focus on one at the expense of the others. Understanding ever-changing compliance requirements, this evolves on a continual basis. Right now, Congress is considering some new rules. If you've heard of the Secure Act, if you haven't, that's okay too. It's probably not on the radar of most, but pretty significant legislation around retirement plans that was passed previously prior to the onset of COVID and the shutdown and pandemic. There's been this anticipation of more legislation called Secure 2, and I think that will probably pass later this year. But all of these pieces drive decisions and drive kind of an evolving world of making sure that we're on top of the requirements and doing that appropriately. Selecting the investment options for participants. This was maybe less the focus than the structure, because the investment options, we want to make sure that that's an ongoing due diligence and appropriate in that sense. And so I want to make sure that that's consistent across all offerings within the retirement structure and make sure all participants have access to the same. Heightened fiduciary responsibilities. We've seen a lot of legislation and then litigation challenges to retirement plans. So I want to make sure that we're aware of that as well. There's an obligation from the high level is to make sure that we're doing right by participants. That's that fiduciary responsibility. But behind that is the regulatory responsibility and making sure those fiduciary responsibilities are executed in a legal and appropriate way. That again is a specialty of Innovest, something that we partner with. We become a co-fiduciary with every plan sponsor that we work with in order to share that responsibility. So planning for that future, I think is key. It's not just the future of the universities and the plans, but the future of you as investors within it. Beyond that, improving education and communication is a theme here. You're going to see that pop up in a number of places, but the strategic response that we came up to was to simplify and to consolidate and make it easier. That was echoed in the survey. It was echoed in the sentiment of the committee, the HR approach to it. I think there's a lot of benefit to getting to a sort of a clean, consistent offering within all plans. We want to make sure financial guidance is offered to individuals and self-directed interactions. We know that's different for everybody. Many will operate through just an app, some through only websites, some prefer to call and talk to someone. Lots of different ways, the in-person meetings, different ways to convey that. Make sure that it's consistent in quality regardless of which type structure you prefer to interact with your retirement savings. Use the scale to access institutional funds. That sounds like it should be a no-brainer of sorts. Institutional, CSU is an institution. Let's make sure that that fits. But what it means is that we have the scale of large dollars, large amounts of assets, the pooled approach of all participants to get access to lower cost versions of each fund that we choose. So there might be multiple share classes and different types of investments offered from different fund managers. If they're doing the same thing, we want the lowest cost version of that in a quality sense. And I think that's then effectively adds to your savings over time. The drag of higher fees is pretty significant. We want to avoid that too. Lastly, improving plan design through plan operation efficiencies. This is a continual effort as well. Just looking at, is there a structural way that we can change the plans to make it better, more efficient, lower cost, while still not dropping off in the service quality and the pieces that go into that. So a little bit, I'll kind of end it there as far as my part, but significant in the sense that, I think Joseph will go through a little more detail of how that was approached. And I think the understanding of the effort here across the board from everybody involved was to get to a better place for all participants. And really that singular focus guided everything we did in this process. Joseph?
Okay, thank you very much, Troy. Thanks for your comments, opening comments, and your kind comments. Thank you, Robin, similarly for your opening and kind comments towards the committee. And thanks, Brittany, for helping making this this whole presentation work well. I'm going to speak to you today from the perspective of the committee that was impaneled by our HR department and team to help take a look at the deep dive. I'll speak from my personal perspective and as the chair of the committee, and also represent some of the committee activities in there. Can we have this next slide, please? So in brief, as has been mentioned, I'm going to go over some of the same material that has been covered, again, a slightly different way to account for the perspective, but also to reiterate some of the important points there. We do have a defined contribution plan. You'll note very quickly as we start talking that some of the activities, many of the activities that we talk about in this work here is some of the activities are defined by us, by the institution, by the university. However, many of them, perhaps more, that's debatable exact amount, but much of this is defined and imposed upon us by external entities, federal, national, and state. So all of the workers in the United States are expected to be part of some sort of a retirement plan. Social Security was created for that purpose. And in certain cases, there are other substitutes for that, as in our case. All of us have to follow, you can, fortunately or not, have to follow the rules that are set out by the IRS in terms of some of the financial regulatory activities. We have a defined contribution plan. It was created back in 30 years or so ago to address some issues that were observed in the university, specifically regarding faculty retention. And it was decided that para was not sufficient at the time to satisfy those needs. So the plan was put together. It is a required plan, all employees, participants. I'll use those terms interchangeably. All the participants in the plan are either current or former employees. They are all of us, our colleagues, our friends, in some cases, our family. If we have family working here at the university, those are us. And as Troy mentioned, the intent of the plan is to help us in here. So we're required to participate. We participate 8% of our gross salary into the plan. And the university, nice spiff here, is the university contributes 12% to those employees who are match eligible. There'll be a lot of jargon and lingo used. I try to avoid that where possible, but sometimes it's the right language to use. Match eligible means literally that. Not every employee is match eligible, but those are, the university contributes 12%. Our contribution is in lieu of Social Security participation. As it turns out, and this has been an issue for many, many years here, but it is something that we within the university have no control over. It is imposed upon us externally. We are not a Social Security participant at Colorado State University. Other universities in Colorado are. We aren't, and so that has been specified by state law. Again, that's not. No one asked me about that. No one asked a couple of other folks around here. It's been imposed upon on top of us. We also have another plan, the 403B plan. This is a voluntary savings plan for those folks who have the assets and the interest to try to put some juice into their retirement plan so that by the time retirement comes, there's more money there. Similar funds, service providers, same ones as the DCP. There's also a SERP plan, the Student Employer Retirement Plan. You'll see, or you have seen, a bunch of students running around this campus. Some of them have work study, some of them are GTAs, and many of them, not all of them, again, detailed rules that we've inherited that are imposed upon us. Some of them participate in the SERP, their own retirement plan. Next slide, please. The committee was formed, was, like I say, impaneled by our HR department and team, and consisted of 5 members there. I, as the chair, served as the chair, and as faculty member. Sue Doe, also faculty, chair of the faculty council. Catherine Duras, the former AP council chair. Bolivar Senior, faculty member, and was the now retired, but was the chair of the University Benefits Committee. Lacey Snyder is a financial practitioner, university associate controller in there. The 5 of us made up the committee. We also had the advisory members on the right-hand side of this, our good friends and experts in human resources, Robin Fergus, Vice President, Bill Lively, Special Assistant. Some of you may know him from his former life here as HR Director, and Terry Sir as our Chief Total Rewards Officer. They were instrumental in helping us get up to speed and do things. Speaking of getting up to speed, we had the Invest folks who were incredibly important. They served as technical experts, and so they bandied about a lot of technical jargon that we had to come up to speed with on this. But they were Wendy Dominguez, who's the principal, founder, co-founder of Invest, Gordon Tuell, and Troy Jensen, who's here with us today. Thanks for being here today, Troy. Again, many thanks for all of them. This is not a mutual admiration society. These people were really helpful. Next slide, please. So to review our current situation, all right, we have some plans. The plans have been managed, have been shepherded over the years and looked at to make sure that they're working right. Yet it was decided a few years ago, and as Terry said this, as Robin said, this happened during the pandemic. It actually preceded the pandemic a little bit. It had nothing to do with the pandemic. The decision was made to do a refresh. So take a look at the plans and study them in some detail. A formal procurement process was executed. Any of you who've had experience with procurement of large purchases with the university know how detailed, onerous, specific, can't think of enough adjectives to describe this, heavily prescribed, that we have to go through in order to have a procurement. The procurement process from the way back when selected three institutions: Fidelity, TIA, and AIG, which you may know as Valak from his former days there. Back then, the plan was set up. Over those intervening decades, we know, those of us who've been around for a while have watched the national personal investment environment has changed. The institutional, the state, people in the states have those have changed. Institutions, higher education, from soup to nuts, all the financial landscape has changed over this time. We've gone from a circumstance where more generally institutions and others have made investments for us to where personal investing is much more prevalent these days, right? The plan's characteristics have evolved also. It's been mentioned. We started out with 30 funds, and I like to use, instead of exponential, explosively expanded to over 300. There are a lot of options in there. This is not an uncommon phenomenon in certain kinds of institutional activities in this. The administration costs have risen. Now, let me talk a moment here about administration costs. There are a number of different kinds of costs and fees associated with investing. If you are a private investigator and decide to go out and buy some stocks, you can do so. All you need to do is call up an entity. Very often these are web-based. E-Trade is an example. You can call up E-Trade and say, I want to buy some IBM stock. And all you have to do is pay a few bucks, and you for the privilege of executing it through them, and you'll own some stock. You may also decide you want to get something a little more interesting. You want to get a managed municipal fund, for example, or a fund that has a combination of a number of stocks in it, like an S&P 500, for example. That is actually, someone has to pick out the funds and manage that fund. And when you purchase a fund like that, you pay a fund management fee to those who manage that fund. The plans that we're talking about these days are layered on top of that. We actually have a plan in the university that has to be managed, administered, and that involves a number of different activities. The university pays for the salaries of, say, our HR colleagues and on us, and it pays for general counsel that does some work there. But there are external entities, this Fidelity, TIA, and AIG are out there, and they basically monitor, collect, and manage our funds. They keep track of all the trucks driving around town with all of our bags of money in them and where they are at any one time and where they're invested in funds. They keep track of loan payments that might be made from the funds. There are a number of different financial services. These are the administration costs that we talk about that are paid to those companies, which we formally call record keepers. They're literally keepers of the records. Those administration costs have risen over the years, as they might, and that's an opportunity that we have to address. So the project committee took a look at all of those plans of the aspects of the planned administration. I see there's a question in the Q&A that's worth mentioning right now. And the question is, why were there no committee members with salaries less than $100,000? And that's simply the wrong question. I will tell you, without revealing too much detail, I make less than $100,000 in this university. I may have white hair, but I don't make that much money. So we have one, and it's true. There is a difference financial risk for employees. These are important things, and we're going to come to. I'll talk a little bit about that more later. Next slide, please. As committee chair, I had a responsibility to set out a goal for us, and we call this the lodestar. Some call it a pole star kind of question. But our question was, how can we set up systems that'll provide the best framework for successful achievement of personal retirement goals? All right. The point of this work was to help our friends, our colleagues, the other employees, and us in the institution. That's what we wanted to do in that for now and for the future. Next slide, please. This was, I admit, difficult work. I already said there's a lot of technical terms used in here. The geoscientists amongst us in this meeting will not get this joke, but for the rest of us have no idea what olivine and feldspar are on a chemical level. So we had to go through, the committee had to represent all the employees in this and to learn a lot about this, more than ever had before. Yet we took on the challenge with gusto and took it very seriously. Next slide, please. We took the top level goal and blew it out into some deeper goals, some more specific ones. We wanted to create the opportunity to create a best-in-class lineup of investment choices. We did not, this committee has not created investment choices. That has not happened yet. It's premature to do that until the Board of Governors makes its final decision. But we wanted to set up the aspirational goals and set up the pathways that could happen. We wanted to rationalize and simplify investment choices in particular, for early career employees so that they get started in investment. There was enough evidence to say that it's difficult for them. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the sophisticated investors have what I call a rich palette of investments to fulfill their own choices. Give them the tools so they can get into the systems and do things. It's a balancing act, but it's one that we think we've been able to set the stage for here. We want to lower the participant administration fees to maximize returns. Did I mention the fact that the administration fees, the fund administration fees, come out of the participants' pockets? We'd like to see more get back into the pockets or not get out of our pockets on the way over there. So that's an important one. We want to make sure that the plan makes sense from the various employee category characteristics, staff, faculty, and students. And as was asked in one of the question that I mentioned, there is a difference in financial risk for employees making lower salaries. There are different ones there, and we had to look into those also. They also wanted to set out for increased education resources and guidance, and we wanted to protect the retired and former employee investments and their situations also. Next slide, please. The plan in brief looks like this. We have 3 record keepers of the record, AIG, Fidelity, and TIA. There's no master administrator. There's another technical term. I like to think of the master administrator in Lord of the Rings analogy, and that is the one ring that binds them all. The master administrator could be another entity on top of those 3, getting some administration fees to manage them all together. We don't have one of those, mercifully. We have over 300 investment options among those 3 record keepers, and we have over 300 for the 403 plan also. Some of them overlap, some of them don't. There are a lot of options there, and we pay for that multitude of options. So we need to manage that. Some of the funds investments are proprietary with the various record keepers. And that, to our eye, sets up a conflict that Troy mentioned that Innovest does not have. If we're being cared for by folks who want to sell us things, that is a wall that is not present and we'd like to see present. So that's where we are today and someplace we want to go. Give you an example of the financial impacts of this record keeping. In one recent year, the total costs for the administration of the plan to the record keepers was $3 million. That's $3 million that came out of our pockets and did not go into our funds. Now, we can't drive that to zero. The folks who are keeping records, they also have mouths to feed and they have to get their fees, but we know we can do much better, and we're going to work on doing that. Next slide, please. This is what I call an experiential slide. It's a slide which shows only a snippet of the palette of hundreds of investment choices. Three record keepers. There are lots of different ones there. There's considerable overlap among the different funds. There's duplication of them. There's also wide variation in the subscription to these funds. Although it's hard to read, on the left-hand column there, the top fund has over almost 3,000 participants in it. The bottom fund has 3. That bottom 3 are likely to be sophisticated employees, investors, and they have their prerogative to go and spend their time in those kinds of funds. We need to take a look at all of them together. I submit this for you to say that there are many, many different ones available. Next slide, please. As was mentioned several times, a survey was performed, and that was in October 2020. You can imagine, if you can think back to how life was in that time. Thank you for the folks who actually spend the time to fill out another form and give back some feedback. I'll just reiterate briefly some of the key findings of the survey, and that employees generally felt they could use more education. They didn't have as much education as they thought they needed to make the soundest decisions for them and their families. They valued low-cost investments, superior financial performance. And when we talk of best in class, let's be clear about that. This is a financial investment activity. So best in class, high performance, high quality means higher return on the investment. There are secondary characteristics that we'll talk also about that are useful to note, but the primary characteristic is financial, and everyone recognized that. We had a number of good turnout on the responses, and we're happy to have gotten that feedback. So the next slide, please. It's a little bit more about some of the particulars. Again, a more experiential slide here. My glasses aren't really quite strong enough to help me read this clearly, but one of these questions here, the top one is, what made you just pick the particular record keeper that you had? And a substantial percentage had no particular reason for picking it. more people had reasons. They had a variety of different reasons for doing that, but some had none. And we want to address both ends of the investment spectrum, the employee spectrum. Those who don't understand, those who understand very well. So we need to look at both of them in that. Next slide, please. Education is clearly important. Last time I looked, this is an institution of higher education, and so we should be worrying about our own education. And so charts like this are certainly appreciated by the quants among us, the analytics, but it's worth spending some time. This shows a financial model for our DCP, an 8% annual employee contribution and a 12% university annual contribution. And it shows that the value at the end of so many decades of service for every $10,000 of annual salary. So this is applicable both to the low earners and the high earners. Every one of us, every $10,000 of salary gets turned into at least 10 times that over the course of several decades. And if you look carefully at this, the family of curves are described by a parameter called the annual return rate. That's literally that. I mean, self-named. It's the return on the investments, 3, 4, 5, 6%. One of the important take-home messages is the more you can put in, the longer you stay, the more you get out. But another one is the plan administration costs come out and subtract immediately from the annual return rate. So every percentage point that we reduce that, we reduce our retirement investments. So we want to get in there and make that as high, make the return rate as high as possible. Next slide, please. So looking forward, the way our recommendations, the committee made its recommendations, and the recommendations include modernizing the plan to reduce the participant administrative courses, to simplify the plan to permit increased participant knowledge, to modify it so that there is an adequate level, a high level even, of participant choice, so that the sophisticates amongst us can have their fun. And it must also protect current participant existing assets, that's past employees and retirees. Next slide, please. Here's a graphic that shows one way that you can approach this breadth of investor sophistication. We define 3 tiers of investors, 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 investors are the ones who really don't like to think very much about investing, and they want to put their plans on autopilot. They would like to have sound confidence that what they have to invest in are good, high quality funds, and they're happy to accept a baseline set of decisions and performance. The second is a bit more sophisticated, let's say, a little bit more interested. They have some desires. They might have some interest in some certain financial areas. You can see large cap, medium cap, small cap, that's capitalization, again, more jargon, more capitalization, or international others. Or some folks have desires to put some social values into their investments. There are folks who get involved in tobacco-free investment funds, or petroleum product free. There's some that can do that. And of course, when looking at secondary properties like that, one has to balance that and question, does that diminish the primary? And for some folks, that's a worthy cause, and that's their choice. So we have a second tier where some of that can be exercised. And the third tier are the sophisticates. And that gray box represents what we often call an investment portal. And that's basically pushing back a curtain where that's a sophisticated investor can go in and make some real heavy duty decisions and work on stuff. All of these choices cost us in terms of fund administration costs. And we value that, we value having those options. And part of the work going forward will be to manage that balance. Next slide, please. So at this point, we're behind where we wanted to be. We expected to be here this day long before, but the pandemic got in the way of things. Plus, we're delayed by other things. The committee formed its recommendations and supplied them to Human Resources in December of 2021. The HR team evaluated them, put its recommendations on top of that, and sent them to the board in the first quarter of this year. We hoped to have had decisions made by the Board of Governors during the summer months, but as many of you may have heard, they were consumed with some other board matters over the summer months and didn't get to it. So we're projecting and we're pushing right now for them to make the decisions in the fourth quarter. Let me be clear. The Board of Governors does not answer to me or us or any of them. They decide what they want to do, but we're urging them and we're giving them all the tools that we can and all the encouragement to get in there and make this decision at that point. When that decision is made, that is the culmination of the procurement decision. They are the ones who are the only ones in the university system who are enabled and authorized to make that kind of a contract decision. Once they do that, as Robin mentioned earlier, there will be an enormous amount of communication from within the university, from our HR team, and from the record keepers. Now, the decisions that can be made are numerous. Well, the decisions could be made to have fewer record keepers or the same number of record keepers, or maybe more record keepers. There are lots of things that can change in that. We're waiting for them to make their decisions. And of course, again, if you're involved in a procurement process, you know that the procurement people keep a tight lid on our yaps. So they won't let us say anything about that. Plus, there's also good hard-nosed negotiating reasons for keeping the lid on that. To get lower fees are going to require negotiations, and there's no reason to show all your cards before you absolutely have to. So these are good reasons for doing that. We expect a switchover to take place. We're hoping for this kind of a decision and expect a switchover in the second quarter of 2023. And that switchover would look like a process where, depending upon the number of record keepers, funds could be switched around. Some would be made more or less available. I mean, an example that I'll give, a concrete example, is there are several funds available in our current hundreds of them that are S&P 500 funds, index funds. An index fund is where a fund manager identifies a number of stocks and creates a portfolio where a proportion of each of those is put into there so that it follows what's called the Standard & Poor's index. That's a measure of the overall health of the stock market. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to go look in the back pages of the Wall Street Journal and find out the makeup of the S&P funds and to put together a fund like that. But remarkably, those several funds that are available in the system have in some cases, very different management funds. The higher the management fund, remember, comes out of your pocket, my pocket. And so best in practice is not to have, for something that is that's equal to another one, the lower fee is a better performing fund. And that's the kind of things we want to be into. So some of these will be taken away, and the funds that are invested in those, our funds that are invested in those funds will be remapped, as it's called, into new funds that will not be lower in performance. All right, I've asked this and articulated that in recommendations. I can tell you this much, that no one is to be disadvantaged, no participant is to be disadvantaged in this process. We have to get at least as good performance, if not better. And we'll keep fighting for that in here. There will be a relatively short period with lots of information beforehand to make decisions, to make informed decisions about how things might take place. And there are lots of rules that have to be followed. Some funds cannot be mapped. Some funds, like some annuities, and I'll say this in brief and probably get it wrong, but I'll say it as well as possible, and that is some funds that are annuities are basically contracts between the participant and the company that holds the annuity, and those can't be moved. So those won't be. So it'll take some time to flush all of this stuff through the system, probably several decades, based on the timelines of these things. Next slide, please. Of course, information is always available on a website, and that's true in this case here. If you go over to hr.colostate.edu, there is information from that website. And there we are on the lower left-hand corner here, the retirement plans review. Lots of information, slides from presentations, recordings from presentations, all that kind of good stuff that you didn't get enough of today and want to have tomorrow. Next slide, please. I'll close by thanking you for your attention today, for not throwing raw vegetables at us, hurling anything, for your interest in this in your own retirements. And I will now throw the floor open, invite Troy and Robin and the rest of the team to help us answer any questions that you may have. Thank you again.
Thanks, Joseph. There is a question in the Q&A. Not sure who wants to take this one. Maybe Troy. Do you think there's a difference in financial risks for employees who make lower salaries associated with a DCP rather than a defined benefit plan?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. There certainly is a difference in financial risk and the dollars at stake. And certainly we want to consider that, especially when we talk about fees. We had a lot of lengthy discussions around the appropriateness of flat fees versus percentage fees, the allocation of that to different balance levels within retirement plans. And I think that's a key consideration. When we think about the investments, though, whether it's $1 invested or $1 million invested, it still is the same performance. It still is the same risk in the sense of comparing to peers and other investments in the same space. So if you have two investments that are structured similarly, they should be competitive in that sense. So we evaluate things carefully just on the face of investments, regardless of balance. And I think that's where the no part comes in. You can have a significant balance and still be subject to the same risk. You can have a low balance and have that same impact. Where fees are considered, that's where there is a direct consideration of how much that impacts those with higher or lower balances.
Can I add to that? Also, the issue of DCP versus PERA is not a decision that we have an impact on. That is imposed upon us from a great measure from historical reasons, but we cannot change that at this point. And that was something outside of the scope of anything that we could do here. We could work within the plan, but not outside the plan.
Thanks, Joseph. I think that addresses the other outstanding question in the Q&A. There's some folks with their hands up, so I'll allow you to unmute and ask your questions. But just a quick reminder that we are recording and this will be on the website. So if you could refrain from sharing maybe any personal information that you don't want on the website. I will unmute, it looks like Jean. You able to unmute, Jean?
And as Jean's working on unmuting, Brittany, if people do have personal questions that they're not comfortable sharing in a broad group setting like this, they can email Human Resources or any of the members of our committee that are here today. We're happy to answer specific questions. We have a email address that Human Resources monitors and will respond as soon as we receive those. Happy to help people navigate those personal questions that they might have.
Yes, of course. Thank you for adding that, Robin. And it looks like we may have lost Jean. So there's another individual looking to speak. No name, but I granted you permission to speak if you'd like. Oh, maybe I scared them by saying it was recorded. We've got another question in the Q&A though that says, assuming the number of record keepers changes, what would a migration process look like?
Great question. Troy, do you want to speak to that? Joseph mentioned the job mapping process. There's a lot of detail that's involved in that particular aspect of the adoption of any new plan. Could you walk us through that in some detail?
Yeah, it is very much a project in that there's a lot of components to it, a process that's well defined. We would look carefully to, again, coming back to that fiduciary responsibility, to be protective of the rights, the investments, the assets, the data, the pieces that each participant has at stake in the process. As to how it would unfold, there's a lot of planning that goes in the front end to figure out, okay, the transition and what would happen there. This is a bit cart before the horse. We don't know the answer here, but supposing that there was a change to a different provider or even consolidation of providers in that sense, we would look to map investments. So if the same investment was no longer going to be offered, we would find the closest equivalent, and we would only substitute with a parallel that would be close to it so that there would be little disruption there. From a transition standpoint, we would look for time out of market to be as minimized as possible. That's sometimes a necessary piece. You might hear the term blackout as a conversion when dollars transfer from one provider to another. There's a brief period there where there's no transactional activity because the assets are in blackout. They're moving from one place to another. Ideally, it would be as little disruption as possible. And frankly, a lot of communication goes into it. We want to make sure that there's a ton of awareness of what's happening, what steps need to be taken. Typically at the participant level, you really don't have to interact with the transition that much. It's generally done for you. There may be some opportunity or at least a prompt to evaluate your assets and make sure you're still comfortable with the allocation that you've got. But other than that, it's largely behind the scenes, and then the more upfront and visible pieces will be conveyed as much as possible so that you know what's happening and when. That is all hands on deck as far as an effort. It's between HR staff, between committee members, the different providers that would be involved. There is really a concerted effort and a diligent process there to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible.
Can I add also that this question has come up before, and the answer is there are no costs to the participants for mapping. The transfer of fees will not cost any, there will be no charges for that process to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph.
Sure.
Got about 2 minutes left. If there's any last questions you can think of, feel free to throw those in the Q&A or the chat. Here we go. Do you have a breakdown of the fees by vendor and funds?
So I'm assuming, are you asking about the current vendor and funds or for future? For future, those are yet to be negotiated. Part of that process of confidentiality with our procurement process that we mentioned will allow us to optimize that opportunity when we negotiate for the new vendor or vendors. The current, off the top of my head, I don't have those numbers. I don't know if anyone else on the call has them at the ready, but we could follow up with those.
Thanks, Robin. There is one other question in there that I see Joseph is typing an answer to. So
I'll speak to that.
Perfect.
Right, that there. So the question is, who will decide the providers, and who will, by inference, who will decide the investment choices? And it is the Board of Governors that will decide on the record keepers that we will use. They will decide on some of the particulars according to the recommendations of how we'll advance with some things. But at this point, the new investments have not been chosen, and they can't be until we know some of these other decisions. Plus, that will be an ongoing process moving in the future. What our best choices today may not be sometime in the future there. So that's going to have to be a living, breathing activity. But a separate group is being set up to address that. Again, of knowledgeable folk. You have to be willing to spend time reading the back pages of the Journal or the New York Times on an ongoing basis in order to be knowledgeable and pick the best. So that's the kind of thing. And that won't be something that'll change willy-nilly. And you know, every month it's going to come back and say, oh, it's a different best in practice. That's not the way that's going to be. That would be impossible for us to tolerate. There'll be a long-term strategy and examination. There's another question about, I'd like to see the fee percentage for the vendors and funds on slide 19. Again, I think that's part of the last question that Robin mentioned. I don't know that the fees are on that slide. This does not enumerate the fees. Those are the number of participants in there and the sizes of the investments in those. That's separate information. Certainly, as the committee, we didn't have that information, and I'm not sure whether that's publishable or available elsewhere. The fees, we didn't think of the fees as a percentage. We thought of the fees as a $3 million total value per year. And while this is not a promise, not a guarantee, the idea that we could get those down to $1 million seems like a relatively easy push. We have smart people helping with that negotiation, and we can hope that we'd be knocking off a couple of million off of that gross number.
Thanks, Joseph. I think we're just a little bit over time, so I put links to the website that will have the recording and does have the slides available, and the email address if you didn't get to ask your question or you think of anything else. We'd be happy to address that in the HR inbox. And then I'll turn it back to Robin for some closing comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. Brittany, thank you for your facilitation. Thank you to our presenters, Joseph and Troy. And again, a huge debt of gratitude to the committee and our colleagues, Bill Liley, Terry Sir, who have guided this project. We very much appreciate all of your good work. And thank you for attending today.